The Arizona desert stretched endlessly, a vast and unforgiving wasteland beneath a punishing sun. The sky was an unbroken expanse of blue, the kind that held no mercy, offering no clouds to soften the relentless heat. The ground was dry, cracked like old leather, whispering the tale of countless seasons without rain. In this land, survival belonged to those who knew its rules, creatures that burrowed deep, scavengers that moved under the cover of darkness. But today, standing alone against the scorching wind, was something that did not belong here. A dog. His name was Duke, a strong and proud German shepherd, his coat once sleek and full, now dusted with dirt and exhaustion. His paws, meant for softer earth, pressed into the burning sand, each step a sting against his pads. He stood where his master had left him, his deep brown eyes scanning the empty road, waiting. Because dogs, unlike men, do not understand betrayal. The man who abandoned him, Hank Mercer, had driven away without looking back. Hank had once been someone worth knowing. There was a time when his name meant something in the quiet towns of southern Arizona, where men built their lives with hard work and handshakes. He had been a rancher, proud and steady, raising cattle on land that stretched for miles. But time had not been kind to Hank. He had made mistakes, the kind that pile up slowly until one day, they bury a man alive. Gambling debts. Bad investments. A drinking problem that started as a bad habit and became something worse. It was the drinking that cost him the ranch. The debts that took his dignity. And it was the shame that led him to this moment, gripping the wheel of his battered 1998 Ford F-150, hands tight as if holding on to something slipping away. Duke sat beside him in the passenger seat, panting lightly against the heat. He had been with Hank for years, through the good and the bad, never questioning, never doubting. A dog like that doesn't understand the weight of a man's regrets. Hank's fingers tapped restlessly on the steering wheel as he neared the outskirts of the desert. There was nothing out there, just miles and miles of nothing. That's why he had chosen this place. He slowed the truck to a stop, gravel crunching beneath the tires. The silence that followed was deafening. For a long moment, Hank didn't move. He stared ahead at the shimmering horizon, his throat dry, his mind screaming at him to turn around, to forget this foolish idea. But the weight of his failures sat heavy on his chest, and he convinced himself that this was the only way. His hand reached across the seat and unlatched the door. "Go on, boy." Duke hesitated, ears twitching at the strange tone in Hank's voice. It wasn't a command like the ones he was used to, it was uncertain, hesitant. He turned his head toward Hank, eyes full of trust. Hank looked away. He couldn't meet that gaze. "Get out, Duke." Still, the dog didn't move. With a frustrated sigh, Hank reached across and nudged Duke forward. The shepherd stepped onto the hot ground, his paws sinking slightly into the sand. He turned back to the truck, confused, waiting for the next command. But the next thing he heard was the creak of the door slamming shut. Then, the rumble of the engine coming back to life. Then, the wheels kicking up dust as the truck sped away. Duke took a step forward, then another, his eyes locked onto the shrinking figure of the vehicle. He didn't bark. He didn't chase. He simply watched, tilting his head slightly as if trying to understand. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The heat pressed down on him like an iron weight, and the wind whispered through the empty expanse, carrying only silence. Still, Duke sat and waited. Because dogs do not abandon their masters. He did not understand that his master had abandoned him. The Arizona sun continued its slow, unmerciful journey across the sky. The shadows stretched longer, and the first hints of evening crept over the desert. The temperature would drop soon, bringing a different kind of danger. But Duke did not move. Somewhere in the distance, a lone coyote howled, a sharp, eerie sound that echoed across the barren land. It was a warning, a reminder that the desert was no place for the weak. But Duke was not weak. He would wait. Because that's what dogs do. He would wait until the sun set. Until the stars came out. Until his body could no longer stand against the elements. He would wait for a man who was never coming back. The Arizona desert did not care about suffering. It did not mourn those who fell beneath its sun, nor did it comfort those who wandered too far from safety. It existed as it always had, vast, silent, unyielding. Duke had never known such loneliness. He had been bred for companionship, trained for loyalty. Every instinct in his body told him to wait, to stay where he had last seen Hank. And so he did. 4 hours. The sun climbed higher, turning the sand beneath him into fire. The heat wrapped around his thick coat, suffocating him in its grasp. The barn at the ranch had always been cool in the afternoons, the water troughs full. But there was no barn here, no trough, no shade, only the blinding, searing light and the silence that stretched in every direction. Duke panted heavily, his pink tongue lolling, his breath coming in short bursts. His body ached with thirst. He licked his lips, but they were dry, cracked. Still, he did not move. Somewhere deep inside, he believed Hank would return. But as the hours stretched into eternity, the truth began to settle in his bones. Hank was gone. The realization did not come all at once. It crept in slowly, like the evening chill that would soon follow the relentless heat. His ears twitched, his muscles tensed, and then, finally, he moved. The search for survival. His paws sank into the scorching sand as he took his first step away from the place where he had been abandoned. There was no direction, only the instinct that told him he needed to find water, shelter, something to ease the fire in his throat. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, its cracked earth littered with scattered brush and jagged rocks. A dry wind whispered through the emptiness, kicking up dust, blurring the horizon. Duke walked. The heat pressed down on him, every step a battle against exhaustion. His legs trembled, but he kept moving. He had survived long nights guarding the ranch, chased off coyotes that threatened the cattle. He had been strong once. He would be strong now. But the desert was not like the ranch. The desert had no boundaries, no fence posts to guide him home. The landscape shifted in endless repetition, each hill blending into the next, each shadow playing tricks on his weary mind. His pace slowed. His head dipped lower. The world swayed around him, the shimmering air bending reality itself. His body screamed for water, for relief. But there was none. And then, a scent. Faint, distant, but real. Water. His ears perked. His body, sluggish with heat, found new strength. His nose led him forward, each step more determined than the last. The scent grew stronger, pulling him toward hope. And then he saw it. A shallow pool, trapped in the uneven ground, likely from rain long ago. The water was muddy, tinged with dust, but it was water. Duke stumbled forward, lowering his head, drinking deeply. The relief was immediate. It coated his burning throat, eased the ache in his muscles. The liquid was warm, metallic with dirt, but it was life. For the first time since Hank had left, Duke allowed himself to hope. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the desert changed. The heat faded, replaced by a creeping chill that stole into Duke's tired body. He had never known cold like this. At the ranch, winter had meant thick blankets near the fireplace, the smell of wood smoke curling through the air. But out here, there were no blankets. The wind cut through his fur, slicing into his skin, stealing the last warmth from his body. Duke curled himself into the sand, his tail wrapped tightly around his body. His ears flicked at the sounds of the night, the distant howl of coyotes, the scuttle of unseen creatures. He was not afraid. But he was alone. The loneliness was worse than the cold. His body ached, his mind fogged with exhaustion. Sleep threatened, but the ground beneath him was unforgiving, the wind relentless. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called into the night, its cry hollow, empty. Duke listened, his ears twitching, but his body did not move. He closed his eyes. The desert had given him no choice. He would rest, if only for a moment. The first light of morning crept over the land, casting long shadows across the cracked earth. Duke stirred, his body stiff with cold. He stretched his aching limbs, blinking against the golden glow of the rising sun. His stomach clenched with hunger, his throat dry again. But he was alive. And then, in the distance, something moved. At first, it was just a flicker, a shift against the mirage-drenched air. But as it grew closer, it took shape. A man. Duke's body tensed, his ears pricking forward. He watched as the figure stumbled, his steps uneven, his body swaying as if each movement took more strength than he had left. Duke sniffed the air, nostrils flaring. The man smelled of sweat, of dust. And something else, something deeper. Desperation. He moved closer. The man took another step, then another. Then, as if the desert itself had stolen the last of his strength, he collapsed. Duke hesitated. The man lay still, his chest barely rising, his hands limp in the sand. For the first time in 2 days, Duke was no longer thinking about Hank. He was thinking about something else. A man who, like him, had been left behind. Duke took a cautious step forward. Then another. He lowered his head, sniffing at the man's face, his nose brushing against the warmth of human skin. A breath. Shallow, but real. The man was alive. And in that moment, something shifted inside Duke. He was no longer waiting for Hank. He was waiting for this man to wake up. Because no one should be left behind. Not out here. Not in the desert. The desert had a way of stripping a man down to his barest self, leaving nothing but the raw truth behind. Out here, there were no lies, no distractions, just survival or surrender. Caleb Porter had spent his life fighting for the truth, and now, as he lay face down in the sand, he wondered if it had been worth it. His body refused to move. The heat of the day still lingered in the earth beneath him, but the night had stolen whatever strength he had left. He had pushed too hard, walked too far without water, convinced he could make it across this stretch of nothingness on foot. He had been wrong. His mouth was dry, his lips cracked. His breath was shallow, coming in slow, ragged pulls. His skin, once fair, was burned a deep, painful red, the sun having claimed him without mercy. The dizziness that had followed him for hours was worse now, his vision swimming even as his eyes remained closed. This was how it ended. He had survived the lies, the betrayal, the loss of everything he had once believed in. But in the end, it wouldn't be the men who ruined his life that finished him. It would be the desert. The fall of Caleb Porter. 3 years ago, Caleb had been a good cop. A detective with the LAPD, he had spent years chasing criminals, real criminals, the kind who exploited the weak, who thought money could buy them immunity from justice. He had believed in what he did, believed in the system. Then, one case had changed everything. A smuggling ring operating in the city, trafficking exotic animals, rare, endangered creatures stolen from across the world and funneled into the hands of wealthy collectors. Caleb had followed the trail, uncovered the network, traced the corruption right up to men who weren't supposed to be criminals at all. They were supposed to be his colleagues. When he brought his evidence forward, he had expected resistance, maybe even denial. He hadn't expected to be framed. The charges had come swiftly: leaked documents, false bank statements, a fabricated story of a cop who had been in on the deal from the start. His badge was stripped from him. His name dragged through the mud. Friends turned their backs. Doors that had once opened for him slammed shut. And then, the silence. No one believed him. No one listened. He had fought for a while, tried to clear his name, but the machine was bigger than him. So he ran. Not in the way criminals did, not in the way guilty men did. He drifted. A man without purpose, without direction. From city to city, job to job, chasing something he couldn't name. He had left Los Angeles behind, made his way east, hoping that somewhere along the way, the truth might catch up with him. Instead, he had ended up here. In the middle of the Arizona desert, with no more water, no more fight left in him. And now, he was dying. Something nudged his arm. At first, it barely registered, a faint sensation against the overwhelming exhaustion. But then, it came again. A firm, insistent pressure. A breath of warm air against his cheek. Caleb forced his eyelids open. The world was a blur, the stars above him hazy and distant. His head throbbed, the pain spreading down his spine. But something was there. Close. Watching. Brown eyes. Deep, intelligent, cautious. A dog. Caleb blinked, trying to focus. It was a German shepherd, its coat streaked with dust, its body lean but strong. The dog nudged him again, sniffing at his face. For a moment, Caleb thought it was a hallucination. But then, the dog huffed out a breath, sat down beside him, and waited. Real. Caleb exhaled slowly, his cracked lips barely forming the words. "What are you doing out here?" The dog didn't answer, of course. It only tilted its head slightly, watching him as if expecting him to get up. Caleb closed his eyes again. His body screamed at him to stay down, to let sleep take him. But sleep, he knew, would be the end of him. Somewhere, deep in the fog of exhaustion, survival stirred. With effort, he shifted, forcing his arm to move, his fingers digging into the sand. He pushed against the earth, his muscles weak, his limbs sluggish. A deep growl rumbled beside him. Caleb froze. The dog wasn't threatening him, just warning. Warning him not to give up. His breath shuddered as he tried again, this time managing to lift himself onto his elbows. The motion sent a wave of dizziness through him, but he gritted his teeth. He had made it this far. He wasn't dying here. The dog stood as well, pacing slightly, its tail flicking with an anxious energy. It moved ahead a few steps, then looked back, waiting. It wanted him to follow. Caleb let out a dry chuckle. "You're bossy, you know that?" The dog didn't react. It simply waited. So Caleb moved. Each step was agony. His legs were sluggish, his vision blurred, his body weak from dehydration. The dog stayed close, walking just ahead, occasionally glancing back as if checking on him. Caleb had no idea where they were going. But neither did the dog. And yet, neither of them stopped. As the horizon began to shift with the first hints of morning light, Caleb felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. He wasn't alone. For the first time in years, someone, or something, was walking beside him. Neither of them had anywhere to go. Neither of them had anything left. But in that moment, it didn't matter. because the desert had taken everything from them. And yet, somehow, they were still here. Still moving. Still alive. The desert morning arrived slowly, stretching long shadows across the cracked earth. The night's chill still clung to the air, but the rising sun promised another day of relentless heat. Caleb Porter felt it before he saw it, the weight of exhaustion pressing into his bones, the sting of sunburn tightening his skin. Every muscle in his body ached, but somehow, he was still on his feet. And the dog was still beside him. Caleb glanced down at the German shepherd trotting a few steps ahead, ears perked, nose lifting to the air every few moments. The dog had no leash, no collar, no owner. And yet, it had stayed. For the past hour, they had moved together, slow, stumbling steps across the barren landscape. Caleb didn't know where they were going. He wasn't sure he cared. But something in the steady presence of the dog kept him upright, kept his feet moving forward. Survival was a strange thing. It made men stubborn. It made them fight when they had nothing left. It made them hold on, even when they had been told to let go. Caleb had always believed a man was responsible for his own fate. No one else was coming to save him, and no one else was to blame for what had happened to him. But looking at the dog beside him, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, some things weren't meant to be done alone. The dog had been abandoned. That much was clear. It was in the way he still turned his head toward the road every now and then, ears twitching at the sound of a distant engine, as if waiting for someone who was never coming back. It was in the way he hesitated before moving forward, as if torn between staying where he had last seen his master and following this new stranger through the desert. Caleb understood that feeling. He had spent years waiting for something too, a break, an apology, a chance to clear his name. A moment when everything would suddenly make sense again. But the desert had no sympathy for waiting. Eventually, you either moved forward, or you died. And so, as the sun rose higher, man and dog moved forward together. By midday, the heat was pressing down hard. Caleb's body screamed for water. His vision blurred, his breath came in ragged pulls, but he forced himself to keep going. The dog, still nameless in Caleb's mind, panted beside him, his tongue lolling from his mouth. His fur was thick, too thick for this kind of weather, and Caleb could see the exhaustion weighing on him too. Caleb stopped walking. The dog stopped, too. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, with hands shaking from weakness, Caleb reached into the small pack slung over his shoulder. His fingers fumbled, pulling free the last remaining water bottle. It was light, too light. Half empty. Not enough for both of them. The dog sat down, watching him with tired but sharp eyes. Caleb twisted the cap off and took a slow sip. It was warm, stale, but it coated his throat, and for a brief moment, he felt relief. Then, before he could think about it too much, he poured some of the water into his palm and lowered it. The dog hesitated, ears flicking back slightly, but the thirst was stronger than his caution. Slowly, he leaned forward and lapped up the water, his rough tongue dragging against Caleb's skin. Caleb let out a soft, tired chuckle. "Well," he muttered, "guess we're partners now." The dog didn't respond, of course. But when Caleb moved to stand again, the shepherd rose to his feet as well. And for the first time, he didn't glance back toward the road. The heat was unbearable. It made their movements sluggish, turned every step into an act of sheer will. By late afternoon, Caleb's legs nearly gave out. His knees buckled, and for a moment, he thought he was going down. Then, the dog barked. It wasn't loud. Just one sharp, insistent sound. A warning. Caleb lifted his head, blinking through the haze of heat and exhaustion. Then he saw it. A gas station. It was barely more than a building on the horizon, sun-bleached and lonely, the kind of place that probably hadn't seen a customer in weeks. But it was something. Somewhere, out here in the middle of nowhere, there was water. And maybe, if they were lucky, a second chance. Caleb exhaled, almost laughing, almost crying. He glanced at the dog, who was already watching him expectantly, waiting for him to move. "All right, buddy," he muttered, shaking his head. "Let's see if we can get lucky." They started walking again. Side by side. Together. The gas station stood like a forgotten relic against the endless stretch of desert. The paint had long since peeled away, exposing the warped wood underneath. A rusted-out pickup sat abandoned near the entrance, its tires long deflated, its windshield cracked from years of neglect. The neon sign above the door, which once glowed bright against the night, now flickered weakly in the daylight, Wayne's Fuel and Rest. Caleb Porter felt his knees weaken as he neared the entrance, his body screaming for relief. His vision blurred at the edges, his head pounding with dehydration. The dog, his silent companion, walked beside him, his ears alert, his paws kicking up small puffs of dust with every step. This was their last shot. If there was nothing inside, no water, no supplies, they wouldn't last much longer. Caleb swallowed, his throat dry and raw, and reached for the door. The door creaked as it swung open, revealing a dim interior. The air was stale, thick with dust, and carried the lingering scent of old oil and cheap tobacco. Shelves lined the walls, most of them empty or filled with products so old they were practically fossils. Caleb's eyes darted around, scanning for anything useful. And then, there. Behind the counter, a small refrigerator sat humming weakly, its power somehow still running. He moved toward it, nearly stumbling as his legs threatened to give out beneath him. With a trembling hand, he pulled the door open. Inside, against all odds, sat 4 bottles of water. Caleb let out a breath, something between a laugh and a sigh of disbelief. He grabbed 2, twisting the cap off the first one with shaking fingers. The first sip burned down his throat, but he welcomed the pain. He drank deeply, his body desperate for every drop. Then he crouched down, pouring a small amount into his cupped palm, and extended it toward the dog. The shepherd hesitated for only a moment before leaning forward, his tongue flicking at the water, his parched throat greedily accepting the gift. For the first time, Caleb felt something close to relief. But it didn't last. The sound of tires crunching over gravel sent a shock through Caleb's system. He froze. Through the grimy window, he saw a vehicle pulling up, a beat-up red truck, its body coated in dust. Someone was here. And in a place like this, in the middle of nowhere, that was rarely a good thing. Caleb moved quickly, capping the bottle and stuffing the extra one into his pack. His heart pounded as he glanced toward the dog, who had already perked up, ears erect, nose twitching. The truck door swung open, and a man stepped out. He was broad-shouldered, his skin leathery from too many years under the sun. His boots hit the ground hard, the sound deliberate. Even from inside, Caleb could tell this was a man who didn't waste movement, didn't make mistakes. A survivor. The kind of man who could be friend or foe. Caleb felt the weight of his past pressing against him. He was a man on the run, with no proof of his innocence and no reason for anyone to believe his story. If this stranger saw him as a threat, he wouldn't hesitate. The dog let out a low growl. Not aggressive, just a warning. Caleb reached down, resting a hand gently on the shepherd's back. "Easy, boy," he murmured. The man outside took a few steps forward, then stopped. He lifted a hand to shield his eyes from the sun, looking toward the gas station, and for a long moment, there was only silence. Then he spoke, his voice rough and unreadable. "What the hell are you doing out here?" Caleb tightened his grip on the water bottle. This was it. A gamble. The kind that could either save them or end them. Caleb Porter didn't answer right away. He was too busy calculating his next move. The man outside, the one standing beside the beat-up red truck, had the look of someone who had spent too many years in places like this, where the land was just as ruthless as the people who lived on it. His denim shirt was sun-bleached, his arms thick with muscle and scarred from a lifetime of work. His stance was easy but firm, like a man who wasn't afraid of trouble but wasn't looking for it either. The kind of man Caleb used to know when he was still wearing a badge. The kind of man who could be dangerous if crossed. Duke stayed close to Caleb's side, his body tense but steady, watching the stranger with careful eyes. He didn't growl again, but his tail was still, his ears flicking at the slightest sound. The man took another step forward, his boots crunching against the gravel. "I asked you a question," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who wasn't used to being ignored. Caleb licked his cracked lips and forced himself to straighten. His body still ached from dehydration and exhaustion, but the water had given him just enough strength to keep standing. He wiped a hand across his face, brushing away the sweat and dust, and met the stranger's gaze. "Just passing through," he said finally, his voice rough from days without water. The man didn't look convinced. His sharp blue eyes scanned Caleb, taking in the sunburned skin, the torn clothing, the way he stood as if he'd collapse if the wind hit him too hard. Then his gaze shifted to Duke, lingering there a little longer. Caleb didn't miss it. "You're alone?" the man asked, though it wasn't really a question. Caleb hesitated. He could lie. Say he had a car somewhere nearby. Say he was on his way to meet someone. But something about the way the man was looking at him, like he had already sized Caleb up and knew he was in no shape to be making stories, made him rethink it. "Yeah," Caleb admitted. "Me and the dog." The man exhaled, rubbing a hand across his chin as he looked back toward his truck. For a moment, he didn't say anything, just let the silence settle between them. Then he nodded toward the gas station. "They got anything left in there?" Caleb glanced back at the dimly lit interior. "Not much," he said honestly. "Some water. A few things behind the counter." The man considered this, then let out a sigh, like he was weighing his options. Finally, he stuck out a calloused hand. "Name's Tom Jackson," he said. Caleb hesitated, then shook it. "Caleb," he said simply. Tom nodded, then glanced at Duke again. "He yours?" Caleb looked down at the shepherd, at the way he sat so still beside him, at the quiet loyalty in those deep brown eyes. For the first time, he didn't hesitate. "Yeah," he said. "He is." Tom didn't ask for details. He just jerked his head toward his truck. "I got an extra bottle of water," he said. "Figure you could use it." Caleb didn't argue. He followed Tom to the truck, Duke staying right at his side. Tom grabbed a bottle from the passenger seat and tossed it to him. Caleb caught it, twisted off the cap, and took a long drink, relishing the way it soothed his raw throat. He poured a little into his hand again, letting Duke drink as well. Tom watched, then leaned back against the truck, arms crossed. "You don't look like some fool who wandered out here by accident," he said. Caleb wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and met his gaze. "I used to be a cop," he said, deciding there was no point in hiding it now. Tom didn't flinch. If anything, he seemed less surprised than Caleb expected. "That right?" Tom asked, his voice unreadable. Caleb nodded. "LAPD, he said. "Spent years chasing bad guys." thought I was making a difference." Tom studied him. "And now?" Caleb exhaled slowly, staring out at the endless stretch of desert. "Now I'm the one being chased." Tom didn't say anything right away. He just reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out a cigarette, and lit it with an old silver lighter. He took a slow drag, then let the smoke curl into the air. "You're talking like a man with a story," Tom said finally. Caleb gave a dry, humorless chuckle. "That's one way to put it." Tom exhaled another stream of smoke, then glanced at him sideways. "You looking to fix it?" Caleb turned to face him fully. "What do you mean?" Tom shrugged. "You say you're being chased. Means someone out there still cares about finding you." He paused, then added, "Means there's still time to set the record straight." Caleb scoffed. "I tried," he said bitterly. "Tried to do it the right way. That's what got me into this mess." Tom took another drag of his cigarette. "Yeah," he said. "That's usually how it goes." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, the weight of it all pressing down on him. And then, something shifted. He looked down at Duke, at the way the shepherd sat so close, so steady. The dog had been left for dead in this desert, just like Caleb. But he hadn't given up. He had walked forward, found Caleb when he needed him most. Maybe that meant something. Maybe it was time to stop running. Caleb turned back to Tom. "What are you saying?" Tom stubbed out his cigarette on the side of the truck and met his eyes. "I'm saying I know a guy," he said. "Someone who knows how to clean up a mess like yours." Caleb studied him, looking for a reason to doubt, a reason to keep running. But he didn't find one. Instead, he reached down, resting a hand on Duke's head, feeling the solid warmth of the only thing that had kept him going this far. "All right," Caleb said finally. "Let's fix this." And for the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't just surviving. He was fighting back. The drive into town was quiet. Caleb sat in the passenger seat of Tom Jackson's truck, staring out at the vast Arizona desert as it blurred past. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, golden streaks across the sky. Duke lay in the back seat, his head resting on his paws, his ears twitching at every sound. They were heading toward a man who might be able to fix everything. Raymond Carter. A former FBI investigator, now retired. The kind of man who had seen it all, done things the right way, and learned the hard way that sometimes the truth didn't set you free, it got you buried. "He won't help for free," Tom said, gripping the wheel with one hand, his cigarette smoldering between his fingers. Caleb exhaled through his nose. "I don't have anything to give." Tom smirked. "Then let's hope he still has a conscience." The town was small, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's business. The streets were nearly empty as Tom pulled up in front of a diner with a flickering neon sign, Rosie's Cafe. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee and fried food. In the farthest booth, a man sat alone, stirring a cup of black coffee that had probably gone cold hours ago. His hair was streaked with silver, his shoulders still broad despite the years that had weighed on them. His gray eyes flicked up when they entered, scanning them the way a man like him did, like he was cataloging threats before deciding whether to speak. Tom slid into the booth across from him without hesitation. Caleb followed, and Duke, as always, sat beside him, silent but watchful. Raymond sighed, setting his spoon down. "I already don't like this." Tom chuckled. "You never like anything." Raymond turned his gaze to Caleb. "I know who you are." Caleb tensed. "Then you know what happened?" Raymond nodded. "I do. I also know that the men who set you up aren't the kind that go away quietly." He leaned forward, folding his hands. "Why are you still alive?" Caleb hesitated. It was a fair question. The people who framed him, high-ranking officers, politicians with dirty money, weren't the kind to leave loose ends. "Guess they thought I'd disappear," Caleb admitted. Raymond studied him for a moment, then sighed. "I walked away from this game a long time ago." Caleb swallowed the bitterness rising in his throat. He had come all this way for nothing. But then Raymond tapped his fingers against the table. "A habit. Thinking. Calculating. Problem is," Raymond continued, "I don't like unfinished business." Caleb lifted his eyes. Raymond leaned back. "You still have access to their records?" "They wiped everything." Raymond smirked. "No one wipes everything." He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen a few times, then turned it around. A list of names. Bank transactions. Wire transfers that tied powerful men to the very smuggling ring Caleb had uncovered 3 years ago. Caleb felt his pulse quicken. "How?" Raymond shrugged. "I kept a few files. Never knew when they might come in handy." Tom chuckled. "Guess today's that day." Caleb's hands tightened into fists. "Then let's end this." The confrontation. They didn't go to the police. They went to the press. The evidence was sent to trusted journalists, ones who couldn't be bought, ones Raymond had vetted years ago. Within hours, the news broke. High-ranking officials tied to illegal smuggling ring. Former LAPD officer framed. Caleb watched it unfold from Tom's kitchen, his fingers gripping the edge of the counter. Duke sat beside him, ears perked, sensing the shift in energy. The phone rang. Raymond answered. "Yeah?" "No, he's not talking to you. If they want a statement, they can print the damn truth." He hung up and turned to Caleb. "They're scrambling." The men who had ruined Caleb's life were now the ones being hunted. By nightfall, arrests had been made. Names that once carried weight were now being dragged through the mud. And Caleb Porter, once a fugitive, was no longer running. A new beginning. A week later, Caleb stood outside the courthouse. His record had been cleared. The LAPD had offered reinstatement. He turned the offer down. "You sure about this?" Tom asked. "Could be nice to have a badge again." Caleb exhaled, looking down at Duke. The shepherd wagged his tail slightly, as if sensing the relief in the air. "I think I've had enough of being the guy people want to take down," Caleb said. Raymond clapped a hand on his shoulder. "So what now?" Caleb scratched Duke's ears, feeling the warmth of something he hadn't felt in years, certainty. "Now?" He smiled. "Now I start over." And with that, he walked away, no longer a man on the run, but a man finally free. The morning air was crisp, the kind of cool that wouldn't last long once the Arizona sun climbed higher. Caleb Porter stood at the edge of a dirt road, looking out at the horizon where the desert stretched endlessly. For the first time in years, he wasn't looking over his shoulder. The world felt different now. Lighter. A week had passed since the truth had come out, since the men who had destroyed his life were brought down by the very system they had tried to manipulate. He had won. But it didn't feel like victory. It just felt right. Tom leaned against his truck, chewing a piece of jerky, watching him. "So," he said, "you really ain't going back?" Caleb shook his head. "I spent too many years believing that badge meant something," he said. "That the system worked if you just played by the rules." He exhaled, rubbing a hand along the back of his neck. "I can't go back to pretending." Raymond had told him the same thing. he had walked away from the bureau years ago for the same reasons. Sometimes, when you see the truth too clearly, you realize you don't belong in the world you once fought for. Tom nodded like he understood. Got any plans? Caleb looked down at Duke, who sat beside him, ears perked, his tail wagging slightly at the attention. I think I'll figure it out, he said. Tom let out a small chuckle. Well, that's one way to live. Caleb smirked. Worked for you. Tom shrugged. Yeah, but I got a garage. And bills. And 2 ex-wives. He pointed at Caleb. You've got a dog and a busted past. Caleb glanced down at Duke again, reaching out to scratch behind his ears. Could be worse. Duke huffed in response, pressing into his touch. The truth was, Caleb didn't know what came next. He just knew it wasn't Los Angeles. It wasn't law enforcement. It wasn't the life he had before. Maybe he'd head north. Maybe he'd find work on a ranch somewhere, something simple, something real. Maybe, for the first time in years, he'd just live without running, without fighting, without waiting for the past to catch up to him. Maybe, for the first time, he'd just let himself be free. Tom pushed off the truck. Well, he said, if you ever need a place to crash, you know where to find me. Caleb gave him a nod of thanks. Then, without another word, he turned toward the open road. Duke fell into step beside him, his pace steady, as if he had always been meant to follow Caleb wherever he went. As they walked, the sun rose higher, warming the earth beneath their feet. And for the first time in a long time, Caleb wasn't looking back. He was moving forward. Toward whatever came next. This story is more than just a tale of survival, it is a reflection on the deepest human experiences, loyalty, resilience, betrayal, and the power of redemption. 1. Loyalty is not always rewarded, but it defines who we are. Duke was abandoned in the desert by the man he trusted most. Yet, he did not immediately leave, did not chase after another master. He waited. Because loyalty, for a dog, is not a decision, it is a part of who they are. In life, we often give our trust and loyalty to people who may not deserve it. We hold on to relationships, jobs, or beliefs because we think they define us. And sometimes, like Duke, we are left behind. But what truly matters is what we do next. Do we stay in the past, waiting for someone who will never return? Or do we find a new path, a new reason to keep moving forward? Loyalty should never be blind, it should be given to those who truly deserve it. 2. The past can break you, or it can shape you. Caleb lost everything, his career, his reputation, his sense of purpose. He could have given up, let bitterness consume him, let the past define him. But instead, he made a choice. A choice to keep fighting. We all carry burdens from our past. Regrets. Mistakes. Unfair circumstances. But those things do not have to define us. Like Caleb, we have the power to stand back up, to carve a new path, to refuse to let others dictate who we are. The past is only a shadow, it has no power unless we give it power. 3. Survival is not just about strength, it's about adaptation. The desert is unforgiving. It does not care how strong you are or how much you have endured. It only asks one thing: can you adapt? Duke and Caleb both had to learn this lesson. Duke had to move beyond the pain of abandonment to find a new purpose. Caleb had to let go of his former identity and embrace a future he had never planned for. Life is the same way. Challenges will come. Unexpected losses will happen. And survival, true survival, is not about how much you can endure but about how well you can change when everything falls apart. 4. Second chances often come when we least expect them. Neither Caleb nor Duke expected to find each other. Caleb was convinced his life was over, that there was no justice left for him. Duke had no reason to trust humans again. And yet, fate brought them together. Sometimes, when we think we are at the end of our road, something unexpected happens. A new opportunity. A person who offers kindness. A second chance. The important thing is that when that chance comes, we take it. No matter how lost you feel, redemption is always possible. 5. Moving forward is the hardest but most important step. At the end of the story, Caleb makes a choice to walk away from his past, from everything he once was, and step into the unknown. It is not easy. It never is. But it is necessary. Many of us stay trapped by things that no longer serve us. Fear, regret, anger. But like Caleb, we all have a choice. We can keep looking back, reliving the same pain over and over, or we can turn our eyes toward what lies ahead. Moving forward doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing to live again. Final thought, we are never truly alone. Duke and Caleb were both abandoned in different ways. They had every reason to give up, to believe the world had nothing left for them. But in their lowest moment, they found each other. And maybe that's the greatest lesson of all. No matter how lost we feel, no matter how much we think we are alone, someone, somewhere, is walking the same road. And sometimes, all it takes is one companion to remind us that we don't have to face the journey alone.